What if I told you that every major economy on Earth owes money? The United States carries over $33 trillion in debt. Japan owes more than twice its annual economic output. Even wealthy nations like Germany and France are deeply in the red. But here's the question that keeps economists awake at night. If everyone owes money, who exactly are they paying? This isn't just an accounting curiosity. It's a paradox that reveals something profound about how modern economies actually function. The answer challenges everything most people believe about money, debt, and economic power. Welcome to the ultimate economic paradox. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. Imagine 5 people sitting around a table. Each person writes an IOU to someone else at the table. At the end, everyone holds a piece of paper saying they're owed money. Everyone also owes money themselves. Now ask yourself, is the group as a whole richer or poorer? The intuitive answer is neither. The debts cancel out internally, but global debt doesn't work this way. According to the Institute of International Finance, total global debt exceeded $300 trillion in late 2023. That's roughly 3 times the entire world's economic output in a single year. How can the whole world owe more than it produces? Who's on the other side of these transactions? The first part of the answer lies in understanding who actually holds government debt. When we say a country is in debt, we're usually talking about government bonds. These are promises to pay back borrowed money with interest. But who buys these bonds? The largest creditors are not other countries. They're institutions and individuals within the debtor countries themselves. In the United States, roughly 70% of federal debt is held domestically. American pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and individual citizens own treasury bonds. The Social Security Trust Fund alone holds nearly $3 trillion in government IOUs. Japan presents an even more extreme case. Roughly 90% of Japanese government bonds are held by domestic entities. The Bank of Japan, the nation's central bank, owns nearly half of all outstanding government debt. Japanese banks, insurance companies, and postal savings accounts hold much of the rest. This creates a strange circularity. A government borrows from its own citizens and institutions. Those citizens and institutions are indirectly part of the same economic system that the government represents. The left hand borrows from the right, but this only deepens the mystery. If a country owes money primarily to itself, is it really in debt at all? To understand this, we need to examine what money actually is. Most people think of money as a physical thing. Bills and coins that have inherent value, but modern money is predominantly digital. It exists as entries in bank accounts and ledgers. Only a tiny fraction of the money supply exists as physical currency. Even more fundamentally, most money is created through debt. When a bank makes a loan, it doesn't hand over cash from a vault. It creates a new deposit in the borrower's account. That deposit is new money brought into existence by the act of lending. The borrower now has money to spend. The bank has an asset in the form of the loan agreement. Central banks operate on similar principles, but at a more fundamental level. When a central bank buys government bonds, it credits the seller's account with newly created reserves. This is sometimes called printing money, though no physical printing occurs. The central bank expands its balance sheet, the money supply grows. This process accelerated dramatically during the 2008 financial crisis and again during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion in 2007 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England all engaged in similar expansions. These institutions bought government bonds on a massive scale. They paid for these bonds with newly created money. The governments that issued the bonds used that money to fund operations, stimulus programs, and crisis responses. So when we ask who the creditor is, part of the answer is central banks that created money specifically to buy the debt. But central banks are not external creditors in the traditional sense. Most central banks are government institutions or quasi-government entities. Their profits typically return to the treasury. When a government pays interest to its own central bank, that interest largely comes back to the government. This arrangement resembles a person borrowing money from their own savings account. There's a transaction on paper, but the economic reality is more ambiguous. The second major category of creditors is private financial institutions. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and investment firms hold enormous quantities of government bonds. These institutions serve as intermediaries between individual savers and government borrowers. When you deposit money in a bank, that bank needs safe assets to balance against your deposit. Government bonds are considered among the safest investments available. Banks are often required by regulation to hold significant quantities of government debt. Pension funds face a similar dynamic. They have long-term obligations to future retirees. They need stable, predictable returns. Government bonds from developed countries offer exactly that. A pension fund might hold billions in treasury bonds or German bonds as a core part of its portfolio. Insurance companies operate under comparable constraints. They collect premiums today and promise payouts in the future. They need assets that will reliably be there when claims come due. Government bonds fit this requirement perfectly. Individual investors also buy government bonds directly. Some seek safety in uncertain times. Others want predictable income. Retirees often hold bonds as a stable component of their portfolios. So the creditors are often ordinary people, saving for retirement or protecting their wealth. They've lent money to their own government through the intermediary of financial institutions. This brings us to a crucial insight. Government debt is not like household debt. When a household borrows, it owes money to an external entity. The household must generate income to repay that debt. If it cannot, it faces bankruptcy. A government that issues its own currency faces a fundamentally different situation. It can always create the money needed to pay its debts denominated in that currency. The United States cannot run out of dollars. Japan cannot run out of yen. The United Kingdom cannot run out of pounds. This doesn't mean government debt is without consequences. Creating too much money can cause inflation. High debt levels can crowd out private investment. Interest payments can consume a large portion of government budgets, but the risk of literal default is qualitatively different. Argentina, Greece, and other countries have defaulted on their debts. But these defaults typically occur on foreign currency, debt, or when a country has ceded monetary sovereignty, as Greece did, by joining the euro. A country borrowing in its own currency that it can issue faces different constraints. This is where the paradox begins to unravel. The debt exists as a legal and accounting reality. Bonds are real financial instruments with real obligations. But the economic meaning of government debt is more complex than the simple debtor-creditor framework suggests. Let's examine the foreign holdings of government debt, which complicate the picture. While most government debt is held domestically, significant portions are held abroad. Foreign governments, institutions, and individuals own roughly 30% of United States Treasury securities. China and Japan have historically been the largest foreign holders of U.S. debt, each holding over $1 trillion at peak levels. This often generates concern about economic dependence or leverage. If China sold its Treasury holdings rapidly, could it crash the U.S. economy? Most economists argue this threat is overblown. If China sold its treasuries, it would receive dollars in return. It would then need to do something with those dollars. It could buy other dollar assets, which would simply shift the ownership of American assets. It could convert dollars to yuan, which would make Chinese exports more expensive and hurt China's economy. The financial weapon cuts both ways. Moreover, China holds treasuries because they're useful. They're safe, liquid, and earn interest. China accumulates dollars through its trade surplus. Holding treasuries is a logical way to manage those dollars. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, not a form of exploitation. Foreign holdings of government debt create real international linkages. They make countries economically interdependent, but they don't change the fundamental nature of what government debt represents. Now let's consider corporate and household debt, which add another layer to global indebtedness. Governments aren't the only borrowers. Corporations have issued trillions in bonds and taken enormous bank loans. Households carry mortgages, auto loans, credit card debt, and student loans. When we add up government, corporate, and household debt, we get that $300 trillion figure. This is debt in the traditional sense. Households owe banks and other lenders. Corporations owe bondholders and creditors. These are external obligations. But even here, the creditor picture is complex. Who holds corporate bonds? Often the same institutions that hold government bonds. Pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds. Who do these institutions represent? Individual savers and investors. The web of debt ultimately connects back to people within the economic system. A middle-class worker with a retirement account is simultaneously a debtor, paying a mortgage, and a creditor, owning bond funds that hold corporate and government debt. The system is a vast network of overlapping claims. Everyone owes and is owed. The net position of humanity as a whole cannot be negative in any absolute sense. We don't owe money to Mars or to future generations in any simple accounting sense. This brings us to a philosophical question. What is debt really measuring? In a closed system where everyone owes everyone else, debt measures the structure of claims and obligations. It describes how resources and income are allocated over time. When a government borrows, it's choosing to spend now and tax later. When a household takes a mortgage, it's choosing to consume housing now and pay gradually over decades. When a corporation issues bonds, it's funding investment today with profits expected tomorrow. Debt is a temporal redistribution mechanism. It allows economic activity to occur in a different time pattern than it would in a pure cash economy. This can be tremendously productive. Businesses can invest in projects before they generate revenue. Families can buy homes before they've saved the full price. Governments can respond to crises before collecting taxes to pay for the response, but debt also creates fragility. If expectations about the future prove wrong, debt becomes difficult to service. If a business fails to generate expected profits, it defaults. If housing prices fall, homeowners end up underwater. If tax revenues disappoint, governments face fiscal stress. The paradox of universal indebtedness reflects this temporal dimension. At any given moment, the world has collectively promised to transfer more resources in the future than currently exist. These promises are layered, interconnected, and contingent on economic growth and stability. Here's another way to think about it. Debt represents a claim on future production. When you hold a bond, you have a legal right to receive payments in the future. Those payments must come from future economic activity. If the economy grows, servicing debt becomes easier. If the economy shrinks, debt becomes crushing. This is why growth is so central to modern economic policy. Growth validates existing debt. It makes yesterday's borrowing decisions look wise. Stagnation or contraction exposes debt as potentially unsustainable. Japan's experience illustrates this dynamic. Japan has the highest government debt-to-GDP ratio of any major economy, exceeding 250%. Yet Japan has not faced a debt crisis. Why not? Several factors explain this. Japan borrows in yen and can issue currency. Most debt is held domestically by institutions and citizens loyal to the Japanese economy. Interest rates have remained extraordinarily low, keeping debt service manageable. And crucially, Japan is a wealthy country with enormous private savings. Japanese households and corporations have accumulated vast financial assets. These assets are the counterpart to government debt. The Japanese government owes money, but Japanese society as a whole is a net creditor to the rest of the world. This reveals another aspect of the paradox. Government debt doesn't necessarily mean national poverty. It can coexist with private wealth. The debt represents a distribution of claims within the economy. Let's zoom out further and consider the international dimension. While most countries owe money domestically, there are net creditor and net debtor nations at the global level. This is measured by the net international investment position. Countries like China, Japan, and Germany have positive net international investment positions. Their residents and institutions own more foreign assets than foreigners own domestic assets. They are net creditors to the world. Countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia have negative net international investment positions. Foreigners own more of their assets than they own abroad. They are net debtors to the world. But even this doesn't fully resolve the paradox. The net positions exist, but they're also embedded in a web of mutual interdependence. The United States owes money abroad, but dollars are the world's reserve currency. Other countries need dollars for international trade. They accumulate dollar assets, including U.S. government debt, as part of functioning in the global economy. China has lent to the United States by buying treasuries, but China also depends on access to the American market. The debt relationship is one part of a broader economic entanglement. Neither country can easily untangle without significant cost. The creditor in the global debt system is ultimately an abstraction. It's the collective belief that the future will resemble the past enough that promises made today will be kept tomorrow. It's the institutional framework that enforces contracts and respects property rights. It's the productive capacity of the global economy that generates income to service debt. When that collective belief falters, debt crises occur. The 2008 financial crisis was fundamentally a crisis of confidence. Suddenly, debts that seemed manageable appeared unpayable. Assets that seemed valuable became toxic. The web of interconnected obligations threatened to collapse. Governments and central banks responded with unprecedented interventions. They guaranteed bank deposits. They bailed out failing institutions. They bought assets to prevent price collapse. They created trillions in new money to prevent deflation. These actions were controversial. Critics called them bailouts for the wealthy and reckless. Defenders argued they prevented total economic collapse. But whatever one's view, the interventions revealed something important. In extremist governments will act to preserve the monetary and financial system even at enormous cost. This brings us to modern monetary theory, or MMT, a heterodox economic framework that takes the logic of government debt in fiat currency systems to its conclusion. MMT argues that governments issuing their own currency are not meaningfully constrained by debt or taxes in the way households and businesses are. According to MMT, such governments spend by creating money and tax to remove money from circulation. The real constraint is not finance, but real resources. If the economy has idle workers and factories, government spending can put them to use without causing inflation. Only when real resources are fully employed does additional spending become inflationary. From this perspective, the question who is the creditor dissolves. Government debt is simply the accumulated net financial assets that government spending has created in the private sector. It's not a burden to be repaid, but a record of past fiscal operations. MMT remains controversial among mainstream economists. Critics argue it understates the costs of high debt and inflation risks. They point to examples of countries that created excessive money and experienced hyperinflation. They worry that MMT provides intellectual cover for fiscal irresponsibility. But MMT proponents argue that mainstream economics misunderstands government finance. They say the prevailing framework treats government budgets like household budgets, which leads to unnecessary austerity and underinvestment in public goods. This debate goes to the heart of our paradox. Is government debt a real economic constraint, or primarily a political and institutional construct? The answer depends partly on one's theoretical framework and partly on empirical facts about inflation, growth, and institutional credibility. Let's consider a concrete example: the COVID-19 pandemic response. Governments worldwide borrowed and spent trillions. In the United States alone, fiscal stimulus exceeded $5 trillion across multiple bills. Debt levels soared. Who paid for this? In immediate accounting terms, bondholders lent the money. But central banks bought much of the debt with newly created reserves, and many citizens received direct payments or benefits funded by this borrowing. So citizens were simultaneously the beneficiaries of government spending, the taxpayers who would eventually bear some cost, and the ultimate owners of the debt through pension funds and financial institutions. The creditor, debtor, and beneficiary were the same people viewed from different angles. This massive borrowing did contribute to inflation in 2021 and 2022. Supply chain disruptions played a role, but the flood of money into the economy clearly mattered. Prices rose significantly for the first time in decades. Central banks responded by raising interest rates sharply. This episode illustrates real constraints on money creation. Governments can create money, but doing so recklessly causes inflation. Inflation is a form of default by devaluation. It reduces the real value of debt, but also harms savers and those on fixed incomes. So the ultimate creditor does have power. That power is the ability to demand real goods and services with the money they're owed. If money creation erodes that purchasing power, creditors suffer losses even if nominally repaid in full. This returns us to the social and political nature of money and debt. These aren't just technical economic concepts, they're systems of social coordination and trust. Money works because people believe it will be accepted in exchange. Debt works because people believe promises will be kept. When trust erodes, systems break down. Hyperinflations occur when people lose faith in currency. Debt crises occur when creditors lose faith in borrowers. The institutions that maintain trust are therefore central to the functioning of the system. This includes legal systems that enforce contracts, central banks that manage monetary policy, governments that maintain fiscal credibility, and international bodies that facilitate cooperation. These institutions are the real foundation of the debt system. The paradox of universal indebtedness ultimately reveals that debt is not a simple bilateral relationship. It's an emergent property of a complex system. In a modern economy, debt is everywhere because credit is everywhere. Credit is the lifeblood of commerce and growth. Every bank deposit is simultaneously an asset for the depositor and a liability for the bank. Every bond is an asset for the holder and a liability for the issuer. Every dollar or euro or yen is an asset for whoever holds it and, in some abstract sense, a liability of the issuing authority. The system works through a delicate balance. Creditors must believe they'll be repaid. Debtors must be able to service obligations. The economy must grow enough to validate past borrowing. Institutions must maintain trust and credibility. When the system is in balance, it feels natural and stable. Money flows freely. Credit is available. Economic activity proceeds smoothly. The vast web of debt is invisible, working silently in the background. When the system becomes unbalanced, fragility is exposed. Credit freezes. Institutions fail. Governments and central banks must intervene. The interdependence that was invisible becomes starkly apparent. So who is the creditor when every country is in debt? The answer is that we all are. Through pension funds, through bank accounts, through insurance policies and investment portfolios, ordinary people are the ultimate creditors. We have lent to governments, corporations, and each other through an intricate web of financial intermediation. We are also the debtors. Through mortgages, through credit cards, through student loans and auto financing, we owe money to the same financial system. Through taxes, we bear the burden of government debt. Through citizenship, we share responsibility for national obligations. The paradox dissolves when we recognize that debt is not an external imposition, but an internal feature of how modern economies organize themselves. It's a system of mutual obligations and claims that exists within society, not between society and some outside entity. This doesn't mean debt is unimportant or that it doesn't matter. The distribution of debt and credit matters enormously. Who owes whom shapes power, relationships, and economic outcomes. Excessive debt creates real problems. Debt crises impose genuine suffering, but the fear that humanity as a whole is indebted to some external creditor is misplaced. We owe ourselves. The challenge is managing that system of mutual obligations wisely, maintaining balance, and ensuring that debt serves productive purposes rather than becoming destructive. The ultimate economic paradox teaches us that modern finance is fundamentally a social technology. Money and debt are systems we've created to facilitate cooperation and coordination across time and space. They're extraordinarily powerful tools that have enabled unprecedented prosperity. But they're also prone to instability and crisis. They require constant management and periodic reform. They embed assumptions about trust, growth, and the future that can prove fragile. Understanding this paradox is the first step toward thinking more clearly about economic policy, financial regulation, and the choices societies make about borrowing, lending, and the distribution of resources over time. The creditor is us. The debtor is us. The question is how we manage the obligations we've created for ourselves.